Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV 9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator today, Karl Cassell, President CEO of Horizons, a family service alliance. Today we're going to explore a topic that has risen to the forefront nationally and also internationally. Business, government, and industry have all become addicted to information. Their reliance on information creates opportunities for terrorism. Imagine a day without the internet, just one day. What would the impact be? Just what is considered to be cyber terrorism. Today we're going to explore the topic of how cyber terrorism is and can affect our lives. Joining me on the panel today we have Tony Mione, Professor of Computer Science at Mount Mercer University. Good morning.
Good morning.
On the end, we have Gregory Edwards, CEO of Watchpoint. Good morning.
Good morning.
Glad to have you guys here, and thank you for taking the time to discuss this issue. So cyber terrorism is a premeditated use of disruptive activities or the threat thereof against computers and or networks with the intention to cause harm or further social, ideological, religious, political, or similar objectives, or to intimidate any person in furtherance of such objectives. So, Greg, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about your company and what effects this has on your business when things that we've seen in the news here the past couple of weeks happens. How does that affect your organization?
So our company is a cyber defense company, specifically a deception technology company. So what we do is we create bait for the attackers to hit within a network or on a PC, and once they do, then our system reacts to that. And specifically, the primary product that we have is anti-ransomware. So it's a post-execution interruption product. So it recognizes that ransomware is running on a network or on a device and then interrupts it and isolates and or stops it. So the events that happened Friday with the WannaCry ransomware, the biggest impact was in the number of interested people in our product after that happened. So it's unfortunate that it takes an event of that scale to motivate people to do something about their exposure, but it certainly did. And our web traffic was up about 300% just since then. So yeah, it's been pretty extreme.
Oh, I bet. So Tony, you're a professor, you're in education. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about what the implications this could have on education or students in general. Do we have students, as you're a computer science, going into the field?
Mm-hmm. I would like to see a lot more students getting into basically cyber defense and security. And there's very good programs out there. We just added a course in fall that should recur every couple of years on information and network security. So I gave the students kind of a very broad overview of the field, talking about encryption, firewalls, network security, system security, intrusion detection systems, and other things like that. But I definitely think I heard a statistic that over the next several years, we're going to need about 16% more security professionals each year upon year. So for the next few years at least, we can't fill that demand. So certainly we need a lot more people going into the field.
And it feels like right now that there are more attackers than there are professionals to defend against it. And it makes sense that the criminals are going after our networks and after our data because there's so much money in it. And especially in countries where there's not as many opportunities as we have here, and they can make millions of dollars a day like they did last week. It's definitely understandable why they're doing it.
So explain that to us. People are being hired to become hackers? Explain that, because people probably don't understand how this works.
So it's not what we think of as a hacker, someone sitting in their mom's basement, hacking away.
Right.
And that's not the case anymore. These are organized criminal businesses, and they're run like businesses.
Right.
They have support departments. They have different levels of support, and they recruit hackers. And so organized crime has really taken over that attacking, the cyber attacking.
And so we talk about groups. Anonymous, for instance, has been one that has garnered a lot of attention. What sort of things do they look to hack? Is it just our financial information? What sort of things?
So anonymous, actually, from the perspective of damage done, they're actually more on the, I don't know if I would call it good side.
Right, absolutely.
But it's more social hacking.
Right.
So they'll hack things like Ashley Madison. They were behind that
Right.
attack because they didn't feel that Ashley Madison was an ethical company.
Right.
So they attacked them, released all of the information of people that were using it. And so really the individuals that released the code that was from the CIA that allowed for this attack this past week, the WannaCry event, that was an organization called Shadow Brokers.
Right.
And I don't know all of the specifics of what they do, but what these organizations will do, I mean, it's extortion, it's stealing, it's racketeering. I mean, it's
Right.
exactly what
It's organized
organized
crime.
crime has
Yeah.
done for hundreds of years. It's just in the last 5 years, it's much easier for them to attack our networks and earn money that way.
Certainly. Do you see this sort of thing happening on college campuses? Are people breaking in, changing grades, doing whatever they can to compromise academic institutions? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I haven't seen as much of that, at least not at Mount Mercy. I'm sure it happens. So I just, I haven't heard of anything. Again, I'm teaching. I'm not part of the IT group. Now, certainly, we're getting attacked. We're getting spam emails that have basically buttons that can pull viruses in. I think we have been hit by ransomware over the past year or two, small incidences. So, yeah, that kind of stuff happens, but not always like students trying to change their grades or anything like that.
Absolutely. So is there hardware and or software that can prevent this sort of thing? I know you work for a company and you're in education, but is that out there? Are the development of these things keeping pace with those folks who are looking to do harm?
They certainly are.
Yeah.
The thing is that it really began with the Fortune 500 companies, and they're very expensive tools, but those tools are coming down in price. And that's something that what we've been able to do is buy those kind of tools in bulk and then resell them at a price that's so there are absolutely the tools out there. It's just that it's kind of people don't understand. So
Certainly.
CEOs don't understand what they need to do, and even their IT departments don't understand exactly what they need to do, and there aren't enough professionals out there to educate enough people.
There's what is it? Some time ago, a lot of companies would tout their security products as, "Oh, this is all you need," and that's certainly not true. As you mentioned, they gather up a lot of stuff and resell it. For a while, I mean, they were saying, "Oh, certificates. All you need are certificates, or all you need is a firewall." You need a number of levels. You need what they call defense in depth. So you really have to look at a lot of different things like your network, your data, how it's stored, both how it's stored in rest and in transit. How are you going to protect your data from snooping?
Yeah, a very layered approach.
Yes.
Defense in depth.
Okay. So what shift in cybersecurity is currently happening? I know last week's attack is probably a little recent to see if there's any other major shifts, but prior to that, what major shifts are happening in cybersecurity?
So, I mean, the shift to ransomware has been happening. The first incidents of that we saw was in 2011. I'm sure there probably were incidents prior to that, but the first commercial incidents of ransomware that we saw were in 2011, and then it has escalated from there. And so I would see, I mean, ransomware is certainly going to be more and more prevalent. And then what we call the hack and attack, so where they'll hack into a network, they'll target companies specifically or universities, hack in and then decide what kind of damage to do. So they'll evaluate the network
Gotcha.
and then decide what to do.
Okay. Any thoughts?
No, I didn't have
Okay,
any
nothing to add.
additional comments.
So,
Okay.
no.
I mean, if I can
Yeah,
add
please.
one
Yeah,
more thing.
please.
The IoT, so Internet of Things, all of the devices. So
Yep.
imagine every device that you have in your home that's
Yeah.
connected to electricity
Yeah.
will soon be connected to the internet.
Internet,
So
absolutely.
all of those devices become entry points
Yeah.
for attackers.
Right.
And the IoT companies are not, I mean, they're starting to think about it now, but I mean, everything from baby monitors to our connected cars
Yeah.
to our fire alarm systems,
Yeah.
I mean, all of those are vulnerable.
Yeah, so now it's interesting you brought up the Internet of Things.
Yeah.
So it's not just that security hasn't been thought out with the Internet of Things, but the problem is because it hasn't been thought out, they could be used not just to snoop maybe on a family, but they could be used to attack someone else's network. In October, there was a DNS provider, I forgot the name, that was literally taken offline by what's called a distributed denial of service. You have a lot of devices that are just hammering the network of this name service provider that translates names to IP addresses. And that was done through IoT devices.
And
Wow.
they literally will take over these devices and turn them into what's called a botnet.
Yeah.
And so then that
Yep.
botnet is what does the attacking.
Right. Well, you bring up soon the cars. I mean, a lot of our cars now, the newer cars, are obviously have internet in them. People are able to have their favorite apps. But eventually, we're going to get to the self-driving cars. What is the future fear and danger that someone could do that and cause major accidents and destruction on our highways and roads?
It's certainly possible, and I don't want to spread fear.
Right, certainly.
But that is absolutely has to be a concern, and really what we need are some standards. So we need some standards around the IoT devices, and then within the auto industry, so that they can build in the security, and so that they're all using the same platform to build that security.
I think one big concern is that a lot of this comes down to economics.
Right.
So you think about all the expense we're going to have fixing cyber attacks. Companies need to start thinking ahead of time and building security into their products. But the problem is they don't want to pay for it because designing the security, building it in, is so much extra effort. A company wants to create cool technology, get that out on the market so they get the biggest market share. Right?
Yep.
And they want to get it out before their
Before
competitor.
Before the competitor,
Yeah.
right? So, and working security into a product after it's been built and shipped is much more difficult. And it's much more difficult to do right than if you thought about it up front.
So, in a world of limited financial resources, who will and should pay for closing the security holes in cyberspace? Is it public? Is it private? Who should foot that bill?
Yeah, I think it's a combination.
Okay.
It's certainly going to fall on businesses first, which will ultimately be passed down to the consumer. But we saw in March, so March 1st, the state of New York passed a legislation regulating their banking and insurance and financial services companies, requiring them to essentially have much better cybersecurity. So that cost will be put onto those kind of businesses. And it's things that they should be doing, but the businesses don't necessarily understand it, don't have enough people to deal with it, and haven't spent the money yet. But they're certainly going to have to over the coming years.
Certainly. Anything?
No,
please.
I agree. It's actually a couple of people. First of all, you have the companies that are going to have to be forced to build more secure systems. But there's a lot of other things going on too. So a company builds a product. It's very well done. It's very secure. But these products are very complex. So they have hundreds of configuration options. So now you have a system person who installs that, and configures it. If they're not careful, they can configure it in a way that makes it vulnerable. So they have to thoroughly review, maybe get a peer review as another person to look at their configuration, make sure it's good. Beyond that, so you have the software company, you have the person who installs the software, now you have the users. Well, you give users access to a system, they make up a password, Bob, okay? They're going to get broken into, and especially if you have an administrative user who has privileges, I would hope they wouldn't have a simple password, but a lot of people do. And password crackers are pretty popular. They run through dictionaries of words that are common, and that's sometimes how an attacker can get into a system. So there's a lot of different levels. I think we need also a lot of education, and I'm not talking about college level education for cybersecurity experts. I'm talking about educating the general public using the internet about how to pick a good password, how to secure their systems, how not to click on buttons and random emails from people you don't know. And even if it's from someone you know, take a good look at it and make sure it's something that looks like that person would send you.
Certainly.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. So what are some of the most contentious issues emerging over how to implement an effective U.S. cybersecurity strategy? And I know it's kind of big and it's the whole nation, but what are you hearing? Do you think there's issues that are pretty contentious? Yeah,
so certainly the legislation that's being brought, and who writes that legislation? Is it effective legislation? That's probably the most contentious thing that I'm seeing right now, because businesses don't want to be forced into having to pay for this, and then some of the legislation that's been proposed just doesn't even make sense. So
imagine that.
Yeah. So that's what I'm seeing, at least.
Okay.
Probably some of the most contentious. But then, this is a global issue.
Certainly.
It's not just a U.S. issue. So there's, and then you could also look at law enforcement and how do we track these guys down, and how do we stop this? There's not an easy solution.
Yeah, another thing to add to the list I gave you of potential issues, now you have the issue of you have complex operating systems, Windows and others running on systems. There are going to be vulnerabilities. They're complex software. You need to update them with patches, so when Microsoft or whatever other company comes out and says they have security patches, you should apply those as soon as possible. What we saw in the ransomware attack, I believe if I read it correctly, was that a lot of those were due to unpatched older versions of Windows.
Yep.
So if someone was out of date with their patches, the actual hole in Windows was fixed in March and distributed, but if people haven't installed it, this is what you get.
Yeah, that's probably the number one thing that businesses could do right now, and individuals, make sure that their patching is completely up to date. So it's not just Microsoft, it's all of the ancillary programs that are installed too. They all need to be updated.
And so you both touched on something. One, you touched on it's not just nationally. We look at corporations like Microsoft. These companies are all over the world. So who is the entity, or what is the entity like globally that would help to really kind of steer the corrective measures needed to solve this problem?
Yeah, so I'm not aware that there's any one entity.
Or
there are some standards entities that can help, especially with the IoT devices, and there are other entities like ITIL is one that and there's an organization called SANS. There's an organization called NIST that all put out different kind of best practices and standards that different, whether it's government or individuals or businesses, should be adhering to. But I'm not aware of a global
entity.
Yeah, and sometimes these standards or guidelines or recommendations have to be tailored for specific industries.
Certainly.
I know in aircraft manufacturing, avionics, they go through what is it called, DO 168B. That's a safety certification, not security, but it's designed to make sure that the design process that went into building those devices and writing the software assures that the avionics, if it fails, will fail in a manner that's safe. That's called fail-safe. When you're talking about protecting data, what you want instead is for it to fail secure. So instead of failing and letting everybody in, you want it to fail in a way that it will deny access to protect the data.
Okay. So we have a lot of analytics. I know law enforcement for kind of petty crime or individual crime can be determined, or at least look to be determined prior to it happening. Can we predict cybercrime rather than just react to it? And if so, how?
So I don't know that we can predict. I mean, we certainly can predict more is going to happen.
True story.
We can all agree
Yeah, I
on
think it's
that.
going to be normal. soon enough.
But being able to predict specific events, not necessarily. The event that happened last week with WannaCry, that actually, I mean, that's something that we predicted back in March after it was actually a CIA tool that was used in this exploit. So it was a vulnerability in Windows, but that our CIA developed and then was leaked. And I mean, it was absolutely going to happen. I mean, you give criminals these cyber weapons, which is really what they are.
Yeah, that's what they are.
They're going to use them.
Yeah, true
and so I mean, I wish there were more coverage, more exposure of those kind of events rather than after the fact.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Agreed.
Thoughts? So how should we respond to the threats of today's digital environment? How should the normal everyday person with a tablet or with a PC sitting in their home, or even small businesses, respond to this threat?
Yeah, the best thing I could think of, as I said before, was education. We need to educate people who are less computer savvy just how to do things safely.
Certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you mentioned about passwords, patching, I mean, start there. Take care of the simple things, and that will go a long way.
Probably.
A couple things here before we finish up. Because people only, when they talk about cyber criminals, we talk about cyber terrorism, we look at stolen medical information or financial data and credit card information, stolen email addresses, login credentials, as you mentioned. But corporate or government espionage, cyber warfare and destructive attacks and indiscriminate attacks are just as commonplace, are happening a lot more. We probably don't read about it, but it is happening a lot more. Why don't they garner the same type of attention?
So, I mean, and this is my opinion, but I think that there's not a lot of understanding of what's happening. So I think it's hard to report on something that you don't understand.
Certainly.
And so just like there's a lack of security professionals to defend networks, there's not a lot of cyber reporters out there. So it's difficult for the reporting to happen when it's not fully understood exactly what is happening.
Right.
Yeah, I think in addition, it's not something that directly hits the American public. We're interested in, well, how does it affect me?
True.
Oh, it affected the government, they'll figure out how to fix it, or it affected a company, it's their problem to deal with. But when you have your personal information stolen and your identity stolen, now it hits home, so the news is going to really portray that as important, and they're going to forget about a lot of this other stuff that's just as important, if not more so, as you said. Let's catch this, this tool was stolen, let's catch it back then so everybody could be kind of on guard.
Right.
Yeah, in the WannaCry event in the UK, there were 45 hospitals that were shut down to differing degrees. Now, if that were terrorists that had gone in and taken those over physically,
everybody would be talking about
it would still be 24/7 coverage. Whereas what happened is it's not as impactful, but it's still, I mean, they had to send patients to other hospitals. I mean, there were emergency rooms that were shut down.
Right.
And so.
Yeah, that's major. Well, let me, as you talk about some of those things happening, it's almost a forced negotiation. So they're forcing, whether it be hospitals or banks or even governments, at some level to negotiate or at least to have some dialogue. And if that be the what type of demands will need to be met in order to cause them to call off the dogs, perhaps, if it's a hospital, or even the instance that happened here a week ago? What sort of demands?
From the standpoint of monetary demands?
Whatever, yeah. So what sort of, let me ask it this way. What sort of demands would they might ask for that we might be willing to compromise on? How far are we willing to go in order to call off the dogs, per se?
Well, so, I mean, it's been shown from a monetary standpoint. There was a Presbyterian hospital in LA that paid $17,000, and they negotiated with these cyber terrorists and paid them $17,000 to get access to their network back.
Wow.
So, I mean,
can you track it? I mean,
so can you track it back to the attackers?
Yeah.
Sometimes, but not generally. I mean, they cover their tracks very well. Plus, they'll also use fingerprinting so they'll put someone else's signature on their attack so that it looks like it came from someone else. So it's very difficult right now for law enforcement to track back. And they use Bitcoin to take payment, which is completely anonymous.
Right.
So,
and a lot of times some of these attacks are not happening from our soil, they're happening from overseas. They're going through 3 other countries on the way here. So there's just, even if you could find the person, how do you prosecute? How do you go after them?
Right. Thus, which was some of my earlier questioning with the kind of a global or an international entity or entities that would go about it. We have some.
We have ways to go.
Yeah, we have ways to go. Some major things going to happen. Well, we are almost out of time, and we couldn't even begin to really get to the depth of what you guys talk about or deal with every day. But we thank you for your insight and your time. Thank you for joining us today. It is apparent from our greater use and integration of technology into our lives that the internet isn't going anywhere anytime soon. In fact, it will play a much larger role in all the things we do daily as we talk about the Internet of Things, but more importantly, in all the things that assist in maintaining our comfort of life. It will be impossible to stop every act, but being able to safeguard your information, your identity, and prevent greater harm is the goal for those working on all of our behalves. We thank you. We thank those for their service. We thank you today for listening, and we thank our panelists for such vital information. I'm Karl Cassell. Thank you for joining us today on Ethical Perspectives on the News, and we hope you'll join us again next week. Good day.